They told you God looked European, soft features, pale skin, straight hair, blue eyes staring down from cathedral ceilings. They told you holiness was white. But here's the part they never explained. If Europe was the spiritual center of the ancient world, why are some of the oldest gods dark? Not metaphorically dark, not symbolically dark, visibly, deliberately black. Let's start in Egypt, before Rome, before Greece, before the Bible was canonized. Osiris ruled the underworld, green-black skin, wool-textured hair in early depictions, god of resurrection, judge of souls. You've seen the statues, but what color do textbooks tell you ancient Egyptians were? Mediterranean, Middle Eastern, ambiguous, safe. But ancient art isn't ambiguous, it's intentional. Egyptians painted themselves in distinct tones, Nubians darker, Libyans lighter, foreigners clearly marked. They knew how to differentiate. So when a god is painted black or deep green black, that's not an accident. That's theology. Now jump to India. Krishna. The name itself translates to dark or black, not lightly tanned, dark. Depicted with deep blue-black skin in early tradition, worshipped as supreme divine consciousness. And before someone says blue is symbolic, understand that ancient cultures didn't separate symbolism from identity the way modern interpreters do. Color mattered. Representation mattered. Now pivot to Europe. Black Madonnas, hundreds of them. France, Spain, Poland, Italy. Statues of the Virgin Mary and Christ Child carved with distinctly dark skin. Pilgrims traveled across continents to kneel before them. But here's the strange part. When art restoration revealed the original dark pigmentation under later layers of paint, many were quietly lightened. Some explained away as soot damage. Soot doesn't contour lips. Soot doesn't define nose structure. Soot doesn't choose wool-textured hair. So why were they dark? And why did that darkness become uncomfortable? Now let's go even further back. Ancient Greece. The word melas means black. Homer described gods and heroes with dark features more often than modern translations emphasize. Statues we see today are white marble, but originally they were painted, brightly, pigmented. Time stripped them. Then Renaissance artists reimagined them, and Europe fell in love with marble purity. But marble was never the original skin. Now here's where it gets serious. Scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop argue that ancient Egypt was fundamentally African in origin and influence. Martin Bernal's Black Athena proposed that Greek civilization borrowed heavily from Egypt and the Levant, culturally, intellectually, spiritually. Godfrey Higgins in the 19th century traced religious symbolism across continents, pointing to African origins. Were they controversial? Absolutely. But controversy doesn't equal fabrication. It equals challenge, and challenge threatens identity. Now ask the uncomfortable question. If Africa was the spiritual cradle of early civilization, if African cosmology influenced Mediterranean religion, if dark-skinned deities were revered across regions long before colonial racial hierarchy formed, then what happened? Why does modern religious imagery overwhelmingly present divinity as pale? Power shifts. Narratives shift with it. When Europe rose politically, it rewrote visually. Because theology is not immune to politics. The gods change color when empires do. Now understand something critical. This isn't about claiming every god was African. It's about recognizing that darkness in ancient divinity was normalized, honored, central, not marginal. Blackness was associated with fertility, with the Nile soil, with cosmic void, with primordial creation. Darkness wasn't evil, it was generative. But something changed. Darkness slowly became coded as negative in European thought. White became purity, black became sin, and that inversion didn't happen by accident. It happened over centuries of ideological evolution tied to power consolidation. Because once race became politicized during colonial expansion, divinity had to align with dominance. You cannot enslave a people whose gods look like you. You cannot justify conquest over a civilization whose deities resemble the conquered. So iconography shifts, images lighten, narratives adjust, memory compresses. Now here's the real question. Why were black gods worshipped across the ancient world? Because Africa was not peripheral, it was central. Trade routes carried ideas, migrations carried myths, intermarriage carried symbols. Before race was weaponized, color wasn't hierarchy, it was spectrum. And ancient people understood spectrum better than we do. So what does this mean today? It means the psychological image of divinity many inherited may be historically incomplete. It means representation in sacred space was not always as narrow as modern walls suggest. It means African-descended people are not spiritually peripheral to civilization. They are foundational. But foundations rarely get credit once the building is complete. They get buried, and sometimes they get painted over. So the real question isn't whether black gods existed. The evidence is carved in stone. The real question is, why does remembering them make people uncomfortable? Let's talk about color before race existed, because we're projecting modern categories backward. Ancient civilizations did not organize identity the way the 19th century did. They didn't wake up debating melanin percentages. They weren't building caste systems around skull measurements. Color in the ancient world was cosmology. Black wasn't a skin tone first. It was a force. In Kemet, the word KMT meant the black land. Not because the people were metaphorical, because the soil was dark, fertile, alive. Black meant generative power, regeneration, the afterlife, the womb of the universe. Darkness wasn't absence, it was origin. Now step into Mesopotamia. The goddess Inanna descended into the underworld, a realm associated with darkness to gain power. In many ancient traditions, the divine journey required passing through blackness, not avoiding it. Darkness was not demonized, it was transformative. Now cross into West Africa. Among the Dogon, creation myths describe the cosmos emerging from a primordial dark egg. The universe began in blackness, compressed, sacred, waiting to expand. Sound familiar? Because across continents, ancient people linked darkness with creation, not curse, creation. Now here's where the distortion begins. As theological systems centralized under imperial rule, symbolic language hardened. Metaphors calcified into moral categories. Black slowly shifted from cosmic womb to moral threat in certain European contexts. That wasn't universal, it was historical. Now let's go somewhere unexpected. Early Christianity. The Song of Solomon includes the line, "I am black and beautiful." Later translations softened it. Some versions changed "and" to "but." I am black but beautiful. One word, one conjunction. And theology shifts tone. Language edits perception. Now imagine centuries of those edits accumulating. Now let's look at iconography in Ethiopia. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church preserved depictions of Christ and saints with dark skin long after Europe standardized pale imagery. Their manuscripts were not confused. They were consistent. Why? because Ethiopia was not under European artistic control during early formation of Christian imagery. So divergence survived. Isolation preserves memory. Domination standardizes it. Now consider something else. Ancient deities were often described as having wool-like or tightly curled hair. Greek writers used terms like ulotrichous. Later translators softened those words to curly or flowing. Translation is power. Choose a different word, reshape the face. And once reshaped, generations inherit it unquestioned. Now here's the psychological pivot. If divinity once appeared dark across multiple civilizations, it means sacredness was not racially coded the way modern systems later enforced. Sacredness was accessible. Human resemblance to God was not monopolized. But when Europe expanded globally, racial hierarchy became legal structure, and legal structure demands theological reinforcement. You can't justify superiority if your God looks like the oppressed, so iconography drifts, subtly, gradually, until the shift feels natural. Now ask yourself something unsettling. Why are modern religious debates about representation so charged? Because imagery shapes subconscious worth. When children grow up seeing divinity in one phenotype consistently, the message sinks deeper than doctrine. It says, this is sacred, this is central, this is divine. And what is absent becomes peripheral. But absence does not mean it was always absent. Now let's zoom out even further. Anthropology shows that ancient trade routes carried more than goods. They carried myths, rituals, symbolic systems. When Phoenicians sailed, when Nubians traded, when Cushites ruled Egypt, when Axum connected with Rome, ideas traveled. Religious symbolism was not confined to borders. So when dark-skinned deities appear in Mediterranean, African, and South Asian traditions, the conversation cannot be reduced to coincidence. It demands connectivity, and connectivity disrupts isolation narratives. Now here's the tension point. Modern Western identity often separates Africa from the philosophical birth of civilization. But if Africa was spiritually central in the ancient imagination, then the timeline changes. Africa is not a receiver, it is a transmitter. And transmitters rarely stay invisible unless intentionally muted. Now, this doesn't mean every god everywhere was African in ethnicity. That's simplistic. What it means is darker representation of divinity was normalized across early civilizations long before racial hierarchy hardened. And that normalization complicates modern assumptions, because once you accept that sacredness wore dark skin historically, you must confront how and why that image shifted. And that shift wasn't divine revelation, it was human politics. Now here's the deeper layer. When people resist this conversation, it's rarely about archaeology, it's about identity security. Because if Africa contributed foundational spiritual imagery, then the story of civilization becomes shared, not owned. And ownership is powerful. Shared foundations require humility. Owned foundations reinforce hierarchy. So the real issue isn't pigment, it's power. Who gets to define sacred? Who gets to define origin? And who benefits when certain images dominate cathedrals, temples, and museums? The ancient world may not have thought in modern racial categories, but modern readers do. And that's why revisiting ancient iconography feels explosive, because it doesn't just challenge art history, it challenges inherited self-image. And inherited self-image is rarely surrendered quietly. Let's talk about conquest, because gods don't change color on their own. Empires repaint them. When Rome absorbed territories, it didn't just collect land, it absorbed deities. it rebranded them. Syncretism was policy. Local gods were merged, renamed, reframed to fit imperial structure. Power doesn't destroy belief first, it edits it. Now think about what happens when a belief system moves from decentralized practice to centralized authority. Local shrines become standardized liturgy. Regional art becomes state-sanctioned iconography, and subtle features disappear, not overnight, gradually. Now picture the early centuries of Christianity spreading through North Africa before it consolidated in Rome. Alexandria was a theological powerhouse. Carthage was influential. Ethiopian Christianity developed independently from Latin control. This wasn't a pale European religion at its birth. It was Mediterranean and African in equal measure. But when Rome became the center, visual authority shifted northward, and the image followed the empire. Now let's examine something uncomfortable. The Council of Nicaea in 325 CE did not decide what Jesus looked like, but it did decide what orthodoxy was. And orthodoxy centralizes power. Once theology centralizes, imagery standardizes. And once imagery standardizes, diversity narrows. By the time medieval Europe dominated religious art production, Africa had become politically peripheral to Christian authority. Peripheral regions do not define canonical imagery. Central ones do. Now let's look at artistic evolution. Early Christian art often portrayed figures symbolically rather than realistically. But as Renaissance naturalism developed, artists painted divine figures in their own image. Michelangelo did not travel to Ethiopia for reference. He painted what he knew. Art became localized. Then colonization globalized it. European religious imagery spread worldwide through missionary expansion. So the face of divinity exported globally reflected European artists, not historical consensus. That's not conspiracy. That's supply chain. Now here's where it gets serious. During the transatlantic slave trade, theology was weaponized. Christianity was used to justify domination. Imagine preaching spiritual equality while visually presenting divinity in the image of the enslaver. Imagery becomes psychological reinforcement. You are closer to God. They are further. And once that association embeds culturally, reversing it feels destabilizing, because it's not just about history. It's about inherited subconscious hierarchy. Now shift to Islam. Early Islamic art avoided anthropomorphic depictions of God entirely, but regional variations still influence representation of prophets in certain cultural traditions. In parts of Persia and North Africa, illustrations sometimes depicted darker complexions consistent with geography. Again, diversity existed. Uniformity came later. Now let's step outside Abrahamic religion. Look at pre-Christian European traditions. The goddess Isis, originally Egyptian, was worshipped across Rome. Statues traveled. Her image traveled. And she was not pale marble in origin. She was rooted in Nile civilization. But once Rome adopted her, reinterpretation followed. Cultural adoption often dilutes origin. Now ask yourself this. When colonization reached Africa and Asia, missionaries didn't simply introduce new theology. They replaced local imagery. Sacred statues were destroyed. Masks were burned. Carvings were labeled pagan. Replacement is easier when you control narrative. And once replaced, memory fractures. Now imagine centuries passing. Generations grow up with standardized depictions. Original diversity becomes myth, and myth becomes dismissed. Now here's the twist. Modern art historians have increasingly acknowledged that ancient statues were polychromatic, vividly painted. The white marble aesthetic we associate with antiquity is a Renaissance preference, not ancient reality. That alone should destabilize assumptions. If we misread something as simple as pigment on stone, how confident are we in other visual interpretations? Now let's go deeper. The association of whiteness with purity and blackness with evil solidified gradually in medieval European theology. It wasn't inherent in early Christianity, it evolved. Language hardened. Metaphor became moral hierarchy. Darkness, once symbolizing mystery or depth, began symbolizing sin. And once that moral coding aligned with racial coding during colonial expansion, theology and race fused. That fusion is recent in historical terms, but powerful. Now here's the point that makes people uncomfortable. If ancient spiritual systems honored dark imagery before racial hierarchy existed, then modern discomfort with dark divinity is not theological. It's cultural, and culture changes, but only when confronted. Now think about identity. For African-descended people globally, inherited images of divinity often did not resemble them. That disconnect has psychological impact. Representation is not trivial. It shapes belonging, and belonging shapes dignity. So revisiting ancient depictions isn't about revenge or superiority. It's about correction. Correction of narrative drift. Correction of selective memory. Now here's the final question for this chapter. If gods once reflected the diversity of humanity, if divinity was not monopolized by one phenotype, if empire reshaped imagery for political consolidation, then what does that say about the images hanging in modern sacred spaces? Are they divine mandate or historical artifact? Because once you separate theology from empire, the canvas starts to look very different. Let's step into language, because before images were carved, words carried memory, and words don't forget easily. Across ancient texts, descriptions of divine figures include adjectives modern readers rush past: dark, burnished, radiant like obsidian, shining black. These weren't insults, they were praise. In Sanskrit literature, Krishna is described not just as dark, but as the color of monsoon clouds, fertile clouds, life-giving rain, darkness tied to abundance. In ancient Egyptian hymns, deities are compared to black basalt and dark stone, materials prized for strength and permanence. In early Near Eastern poetry, divine figures are associated with dark metals, polished and gleaming. Darkness was luxury. Darkness was depth. Darkness was mystery worth revering. Now ask yourself, when did dark become default negative in spiritual language? Because that shift didn't exist everywhere at once. It crystallized over time. And once crystallized, it rewrote interpretation backward. Now let's talk about etymology. The word Ethiopia in ancient Greek meant burnt-faced, but not in the modern pejorative sense. It referred to people south of Egypt, known to Greeks through trade and diplomacy. They were not mythical. They were recognized, respected. In some Greek myths, the gods visit Ethiopia. Homer calls Ethiopians blameless. Blameless. Not savage, not cursed, blameless. Now imagine how different that sounds from later colonial descriptions. Narratives don't just evolve, they invert. Now consider something else. Ancient travelers often wrote about Nubia and Cush with admiration. These were powerful kingdoms. Cush ruled Egypt during the 25th dynasty. Black pharaohs, documented, carved in stone. These weren't fringe rulers, they were central. Now fast forward. Later European historians often minimized or segregated Kushite rule as anomaly rather than continuity. Language shifts subtly. Interlude, foreign dynasty, dark period. Notice that phrase, dark period, sometimes literally referencing color, but linguistically loaded nonetheless. Now here's where the conversation widens. In many African cosmologies, the supreme deity is beyond depiction, infinite, primordial, pre-light. The concept of divine darkness predates Abrahamic theology entirely. Darkness as original state of being, before form, before division. Now compare that to Genesis. In the beginning, darkness was upon the face of the deep. Darkness precedes light. Yet modern spiritual art rarely emphasizes that primordial darkness. It emphasizes the light that follows. Selective focus shapes perception. Now here's something even sharper. When colonial missionaries encountered African spiritual systems, they often labeled them pagan or demonic without fully understanding symbolic structures. Complex cosmologies were flattened into caricature, and when flattened, reinterpretation becomes easy. Erase nuance, insert hierarchy. Now let's pivot into psychology. If a society grows up seeing divinity consistently represented in one narrow form, it internalizes hierarchy unconsciously. Representation is not cosmetic, it is formative. Ancient cultures understood this instinctively. That's why gods often resembled the people who worshiped them, not because they were making anthropological claims, but because divinity was relational. Now here's the crucial difference. Ancient diversity in divine imagery did not require uniformity. Multiple cultures could revere different forms without crisis. But once monotheistic dominance consolidated under empire, uniform imagery became tied to orthodoxy, and orthodoxy resists variation. Now think about something even more uncomfortable. During the Enlightenment, European thinkers increasingly racialized history itself. They began categorizing civilizations by race, assigning progress to whiteness and stagnation elsewhere. That intellectual shift reinterpreted ancient art retroactively. If a dark-skinned deity appeared in early iconography, reinterpretation followed. Symbolic, allegorical, non-literal, anything but ancestral, because accepting ancestral influence destabilized racial hierarchies being constructed at the time. Now here's the pattern emerging. Dark divine imagery was not rare. It was normalized across multiple early civilizations. But as racial ideology hardened in the modern era, that normalization became inconvenient, and inconvenient memory gets archived quietly, not destroyed outright, just sidelined. Now let's step into modern times. When discussions about dark-skinned sacred figures arise, they often trigger immediate polarization. Why? Because it touches identity. It touches belonging. It touches inherited narratives about who stands closest to the sacred. And that proximity has historically justified power. Now ask yourself something calmly. If ancient spiritual traditions were more visually diverse than modern standardized depictions suggest, does that threaten faith, or does it simply broaden history? Because expanding imagery doesn't diminish belief, it contextualizes it. And context is not the enemy of spirituality, it's the enemy of monopoly. Now here's the real tension. When you trace divine darkness across continents, you don't find isolation. You find connection, trade, migration, exchange. You find a world less segregated than later centuries would imply. And that realization unsettles tidy civilizational boundaries. Because once you accept shared spiritual ancestry, superiority narratives weaken, and shared ancestry is humbling. So the real question is not, were there black gods? The evidence across art, language, and literature says yes. The real question is, why did remembering that become controversial? Let's talk about archives, because sometimes the most revealing evidence isn't what survived, it's what disappeared. During the European colonial expansion into Africa, Asia, and the Americas, missionaries and administrators documented everything: languages, rituals, oral traditions, local deities, sacred art. But documentation is not preservation, it is control. Countless sacred objects were confiscated, shipped to European museums, stripped of context, and labeled tribal art. Masks that once embodied divine presence became anthropological curiosities. Sacred statues became display cases, and once placed under glass, meaning shifts. The object remains, the theology evaporates. Now imagine centuries of that process. Imagine sacred images of dark deities removed from communities that understood them, relocated to institutions that didn't, stripped of ritual context, redefined through foreign interpretation, reclassified as myth rather than theology. That isn't accident. That's epistemic domination. Now zoom further out. Colonial education systems replaced indigenous cosmologies with European religious instruction. In many regions, children were taught to reject ancestral imagery as primitive. Generations grew up distancing themselves from sacred art that reflected their own heritage. And over time, that distancing became normal. Now here's the quiet violence. When a people internalize that their ancestral divine imagery is inferior, they don't just lose art, they lose psychological continuity. Because gods are not decorations, they are mirrors, and breaking the mirror fractures self-perception. Now let's shift focus. In the 18th and 19th centuries, European anthropologists cataloged African religions extensively, but they did so through frameworks designed to prove European superiority. Complex metaphysical systems were described as animism. Advanced cosmologies were labeled superstition. Symbolism was flattened into stereotype, and once flattened, it became easy to argue that divinity in its highest form must have originated elsewhere. That intellectual framing did not disappear. It seeped into academia, into textbooks, into public consciousness. Now consider something else. When ancient Mediterranean artifacts showing darker divine figures were uncovered during colonial excavations, interpretation often defaulted to environmental explanation. They darkened over time. They were symbolic. They were artistic exaggeration. Explanations multiplied. Acceptance stalled, because acceptance required redrawing civilizational hierarchy. Now here's where suppression becomes subtle. You don't need to destroy every image. You only need to change emphasis. Museums can display thousands of artifacts while highlighting only the pieces that fit prevailing narrative. Textbooks can mention African kingdoms while dedicating entire chapters to Greece and Rome. Omission is quieter than destruction, but equally effective. Now let's move into the modern era. In the early 20th century, as Pan-African movements gained strength, interest in ancient African influence surged. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote about Ethiopia's grandeur. African historians began re-examining Nile Valley civilization. The idea that Africa contributed foundational spiritual systems re-emerged publicly, and resistance followed, because reclaiming spiritual centrality challenges colonial residue. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. The debate about black gods is not purely historical. It is psychological. It challenges inherited imagery that has shaped identity for centuries. For African-descended people, Reclaiming ancient divine representation can be empowering. For others, it can feel destabilizing, and destabilization triggers defensiveness. Now let's talk about restoration. In recent decades, conservation scientists have used advanced imaging to uncover original pigments on ancient statues. Traces of darker tones have been revealed beneath centuries of wear, not always dramatic, but present, and every trace forces reinterpretation. Because if marble was never meant to be white, then classical purity was aesthetic myth, and aesthetic myths shape racial myths. Now here's the final layer. Suppression is rarely loud. It's bureaucratic. It's curricular. It's curatorial. It's the slow narrowing of what is emphasized and what is sidelined. The gods didn't vanish overnight. They faded in syllabus margins. They faded in translation choices. They faded in gallery captions. And over centuries, fading feels like absence. But fading is not absence. It's deliberate dimming. Now ask yourself calmly, if sacred imagery once reflected a broader spectrum of humanity, if colonial power reshaped representation, if education systems reinforced that reshaping, then how much of what we assume about divine appearance is theology? And how much is empire? Because empires rise and fall, but their images linger. And sometimes the most radical act isn't invention, it's remembering. Let's step into something scholars rarely say plainly. Religions do not emerge in isolation. They overlap, they borrow, they absorb. And when you lay ancient mythologies side by side, patterns start repeating in ways that make coincidence uncomfortable. Look at the dying and rising god motif. Osiris in Egypt, Dionysus in Greece, Tammuz in Mesopotamia, Adonis later in Rome, different names, same architecture, death, descent, return. And where does that pattern begin earliest in organized theological form? Along the Nile. Now here's the detail that matters. Osiris was not pale marble, he was dark, green-black skin and temple carvings, associated with fertile soil, resurrection, cyclical life, and that template, divine death and rebirth, travels northward into Mediterranean myth. Now shift to divine motherhood, Isis nursing Horus. Centuries later, Mary nursing Christ. The visual parallel is so strong that early Christian art historians openly acknowledge the borrowing. But here's what quietly disappears in many retellings. Isis was African. Her image traveled into Europe long before Christianity formalized Marian devotion. So when you see Madonna and child imagery across Europe, the lineage runs deeper than Renaissance canvases. Now let's widen further. Solar worship. Ra in Egypt, Surya in India, Helios in Greece. Across continents, the sun becomes central deity. But in early Egyptian cosmology, the sun emerges from noon, primordial darkness. Creation begins in blackness. Light comes later. Yet modern Western theology often equates light exclusively with goodness and darkness with evil. That dichotomy is not ancient. It is constructed. Now step into the Kushite and Nubian influence again, but not politically, symbolically. When Kush ruled Egypt, temple iconography blended African and Nile Valley aesthetics seamlessly. No anxiety, no crisis, just continuity. Only later historians created sharp divisions. Now let's travel east. In early Buddhist art, the Buddha was not always depicted with a pale tone. Regional variations reflected geography. In Southeast Asia, darker representations appear. But as Western influence grew in global art markets, certain aesthetic standards became dominant. Representation narrows again. Now let's address something deeper. Anthropology shows that humans tend to envision gods in their own image. This is universal. So when ancient African civilizations created gods with dark features, that was natural. When Mediterranean cultures interacted with Africa through trade and diplomacy, cross-pollination occurred, and divine imagery evolved with it. But once racial hierarchy became institutionalized in the modern era, that natural anthropomorphic diversity became politically charged, and politically charged imagery gets policed. Now here's the uncomfortable psychological reality. For centuries, whiteness has been associated with divinity in Western-dominated imagery. That association did not emerge from early global consensus. It emerged from power consolidation, and once internalized, it feels sacred rather than historical. Challenging it feels like attacking faith, even when the challenge is purely artistic and historical. Now think about what this means. If early divine imagery across Africa, the Mediterranean, and parts of Asia included dark-skinned figures revered as supreme, then spiritual centrality was never racially exclusive. Exclusivity came later, and later narratives rarely admit they are later. Now here's the layer most people skip. This conversation is not about claiming every deity was African. It's about tracing influence networks honestly. Civilizations were not isolated islands. Egypt influenced Greece. Greece influenced Rome. Rome influenced Europe. Africa influenced all of them at various stages. So when African features appear in early divine art across regions, the conversation should be about connectivity, not dismissal. Connectivity is messy, but history is messy. Now here's where it becomes modern. For African-descended communities globally, reclaiming awareness of ancient sacred imagery that reflected them is not about supremacy. It's about psychological restoration. It disrupts the idea that spirituality began elsewhere and was delivered to them later. It restores continuity. Continuity builds dignity, and dignity threatens hierarchies built on inherited inferiority myths. Now pause. If divine imagery once spanned a broad spectrum of human features, if cross-cultural exchange shaped myth long before colonialism, if power later narrowed representation, then what are we really arguing about? Not art, not pigment. We are arguing about narrative ownership. Who gets to define the spiritual origin story of civilization? Because origin stories anchor identity, and identity anchors power. So, the tension around black gods is not theological. It is civilizational. And civilizational myths are not surrendered easily. Let's talk about memory distortion, because civilizations don't just forget, they curate. Think about how collective memory works. You inherit a story long enough, and it starts to feel ancient, even if it isn't. You repeat an image long enough, and it becomes sacred, even if it was introduced late. Most people assume the face of divinity they grew up seeing is the original, but original according to whom? Original according to which century? Now imagine living in medieval Europe. Most people couldn't read. Scripture was heard, not studied. Imagery was theology. Stained glass, murals, statues, these were your Bible. If those images were standardized by regional artists reflecting their own populations, you would internalize that form as divine truth. Now expand that globally through colonial expansion. Those same standardized images travel to Africa, Asia, the Americas. They become exported spirituality. Over generations, the exported image overwrites local memory, and eventually, the overwrite feels original. That's how psychological colonization works. Now consider something subtle. Even in regions where dark-skinned sacred imagery survived, like parts of Eastern Christianity, those images were often treated as exotic by Western Europe, not central, peripheral. And peripheral means less authoritative. Authority shapes canon. Canon shapes belief. Now here's where it becomes personal. When people encounter historical evidence of darker divine imagery, the reaction is rarely neutral curiosity. It's emotional, because sacred imagery is tied to identity security. If your inherited image of God changes, it feels destabilizing, not because faith collapses, but because familiarity does. And humans defend familiarity instinctively. Now zoom out. The modern world was built on rigid racial categories that did not exist in the same way in antiquity. Those categories retroactively colored our interpretation of ancient art. If we see a dark-skinned deity today, modern race filters activate automatically. Ancient viewers didn't process it that way. They processed through geography, symbolism, cosmology. We process through race, and that projection distorts interpretation. Now think about educational systems. How many global history courses deeply explore African spiritual influence outside of slavery narratives? How often is Africa introduced as theological origin rather than colonial victim? Curriculum shapes perception, and perception shapes possibility. If Africa is rarely presented as philosophical center, then evidence suggesting spiritual centrality feels radical, even when it isn't. Now let's pivot to something more intimate. Imagine a child of African descent walking into a sacred space and never seeing themselves reflected in the divine imagery. Generation after generation. Subtle message. You are adjacent to holiness, not representative of it. That psychological distance accumulates. Representation is not trivial decoration. It informs subconscious worth. Now imagine rediscovering that ancient civilizations revered dark-skinned deities openly, not as exception, but as norm. That changes something internally, not in arrogance, in alignment. Alignment with history rather than exclusion from it. Now here's the uncomfortable layer. For centuries, Western intellectual movements framed Africa as lacking written philosophy, lacking structured theology, lacking complex metaphysics. That narrative justified domination. If Africa was spiritually foundational, that justification weakens. So suppression wasn't always loud censorship, it was selective emphasis. Highlight Greece, minimize Nile influence, highlight Rome, ignore Kush, highlight Renaissance, silence, Aksum. Over time, the omissions feel natural. Now here's where it gets sharper. When modern scholars revisit ancient evidence and suggest broader African influence, critics often accuse them of political agenda. But consider this. For centuries, Eurocentric framing was not called political. It was called objective. Objectivity often disguises inherited bias. Rebalancing feels political only because imbalance was normalized. Now think about the phrase black gods. Why does it feel controversial? Because it collides with centuries of visual conditioning. But controversy is not proof of falsehood. It is proof of tension. And tension reveals where myth meets memory. Now let's ask the real question. If sacred imagery once reflected humanity broadly, if later empires narrowed representation, if education reinforced that narrowing, then what are we really confronting? Not pigment, not statues. We are confronting the architecture of self-image built over centuries. And architecture resists demolition. Because when you shift the face of the sacred, you shift the story of who stands closest to the sacred, and proximity to the sacred has always translated into social power. So this isn't just art history, it's psychological infrastructure, and infrastructure is rarely dismantled quietly. Let's talk about academic gatekeeping, because history isn't just discovered, it's approved. For an idea to enter mainstream consensus, it has to pass through peer review, institutional reputation, funding committees, and academic politics. And controversial ideas face higher barriers, not because they're automatically false, because they're disruptive. Now consider this. When scholars like Cheikh Anta Diop argue that ancient Egypt was fundamentally African in culture and population, he wasn't ignored because he lacked evidence. He was resisted because his conclusion destabilized entrenched narratives. Diop used linguistics, melanin dosage tests, cultural continuity arguments. His work forced debate, and debate threatens comfort. Now fast forward. Martin Bernal's Black Athena proposed that Greek civilization borrowed heavily from Egypt and the Near East. The reaction was fierce, not just academic disagreement, intellectual hostility. Because if Greek philosophy, the foundation of Western intellectual identity, was heavily indebted to Africa, the civilizational hierarchy shifts, and hierarchies are defended. Now here's the subtle part. Mainstream scholarship often frames itself as neutral, but neutrality operates within inherited paradigms. If the paradigm assumes Europe as primary origin point, evidence that complicates that assumption must overcome higher skepticism thresholds. It must be airtight, flawless, beyond doubt. While Eurocentric assumptions historically did not face that same burden. Now let's examine archaeology. Ancient art depicting darker divine figures is often interpreted through local symbolism first, and that's fair. But when patterns appear across multiple regions, similar iconography, shared myth structures, parallel divine archetypes, the possibility of cross-cultural transmission should be explored without fear. Fear stifles inquiry. Now consider excavation politics. Who funds digs? Who controls museum acquisitions? Who publishes journals? Power influences which questions get pursued and which get sidelined. This doesn't mean conspiracy. It means institutions reflect dominant perspectives. Now imagine proposing a research project exploring African spiritual influence on early Mediterranean religion. Funding panels may worry about controversy. Universities may fear politicization. Risk management shapes scholarship, so certain questions remain underexplored not because they're disproven, but because they're professionally risky. Now here's where it gets sharper. In the 19th century, racial anthropology shaped early archaeology heavily. Scholars categorized civilizations hierarchically. That bias influenced interpretation of artifacts for generations. Modern scholarship has corrected much of that, but intellectual inertia lingers. Frameworks don't vanish overnight. Now ask yourself something honest. If an ancient Mediterranean statue clearly showed dark skin and African features, would modern interpretation emphasize African influence quickly, or would alternative explanations be exhausted first? Healthy skepticism is good, but selective skepticism reveals bias. Now here's something rarely admitted. Historical consensus often lags behind evidence. New interpretations take decades to gain acceptance, not because scholars are malicious, because paradigms shift slowly. Thomas Kuhn wrote about scientific revolutions, how dominant paradigms resist change until anomalies accumulate beyond denial. History works the same way. Now imagine the anomaly. Widespread ancient divine imagery reflecting darker phenotypes across multiple civilizations. Cross-cultural myth borrowing from Africa into Europe and Asia. Documented African kingdoms interacting diplomatically and commercially with Mediterranean powers. That's not fringe, that's record. The debate is about emphasis. Now here's where it becomes emotional. When someone says, the black gods theory is political, what they often mean is, it challenges the version of history I inherited. But inherited history is not sacred, it's provisional. Every generation revises. Now consider the irony. For centuries, colonial narratives were deeply political. They justified conquest, slavery, exploitation. But those narratives were framed as objective history. Re-examining African spiritual influence feels political only because the previous imbalance was normalized. Now let's step into modern media. When discussions about ancient African influence trend online, they often polarize quickly. Some exaggerate claims irresponsibly. Others dismiss all discussion outright. The truth lies between extremes. Serious scholarship requires nuance. Nuance doesn't go viral, but it matters. Now here's the core. The existence of darker divine imagery in ancient civilizations is not a radical claim. It's documented. The question is not whether it existed. The question is how central it was, and why that centrality was later diminished. And that requires courage, because recentering Africa spiritually means recalibrating Western intellectual origin myths. And origin myths anchor identity. Identity anchors power, so resistance is predictable. But predictable resistance is not proof of error, it's proof of impact. Let's strip the conversation down to something most people never question. Why did ancient civilizations make their gods look like themselves? Not metaphorically, physically. Why were deities sculpted with local features? Because divinity was proximity. If a god looks like you, then holiness is not foreign, it's intimate. It lives in your reflection. Now imagine the psychological power of that. If divine authority mirrors your face, your culture inherits sacred legitimacy. That's not coincidence, that's design. Now fast forward into the formation of global monotheism. As empires expanded, so did theology. And theology became centralized, standardized, codified. Once doctrine becomes centralized, imagery becomes controlled. Control imagery. You control imagination. Control imagination. You control belonging. Now here's the part most people avoid. When monotheistic religions spread through conquest, conversion, and empire building, they didn't just export belief systems. They exported visual frameworks, icons, manuscripts, mosaics, paintings, faces. And over time, the exported face becomes the official face, not because it was historically universal, because it became institutionally dominant. Now let's talk about something uncomfortable. If the sacred image consistently shifts toward lighter phenotypes in post-imperial centuries, what does that signal? It signals alignment between political power and divine imagery. Empires sanctify themselves through art. Now reverse that question. If ancient civilizations once depicted divinity with darker complexions, what does that imply about their understanding of sacred humanity? It implies no cognitive separation between dark skin and divinity. None. Which means racialized theology is modern, not ancient. That's a massive shift, because much of modern racial hierarchy was subconsciously reinforced through theology. If the highest spiritual symbol resembles the ruling class, hierarchy feels heaven approved. Now imagine dismantling that visual reinforcement. Imagine rediscovering that the sacred once reflected darker humanity openly. The psychological rebalancing is profound, not because it flips supremacy, because it removes exclusivity. Now let's examine scriptural interpretation. Many ancient texts describe divine figures using symbolic language tied to geography. Dark as fertile soil, dark as storm clouds, dark as cosmic void. Darkness wasn't evil, it was generative. Later European interpretations increasingly moralized light and dark symbolically. Light equated with purity, dark equated with sin. But that moral coding intensified during eras of racial consolidation. Coincidence? Or cultural drift shaped by power? Now think carefully. If theological symbolism evolves alongside political dominance, then divine imagery is not static. It mirrors the ruling imagination. Now let's confront a harder layer. If Africa was among the earliest cradles of organized spiritual systems, Nile cosmology, Kushite theology, Ethiopian Christianity, then African spiritual aesthetics would logically influence early monotheistic frameworks. But as power shifted northward and westward, aesthetic dominance shifted too. And aesthetic dominance shapes what later generations perceive as default. Default is rarely original. Default is often victorious. Now ask yourself something quiet. If you were told your ancestors were spiritually peripheral for centuries, how would that shape collective identity? If divine imagery never resembled you, how would that shape subconscious self-worth? And if you suddenly rediscovered evidence that it once did, what would that do internally? This is not about replacing one image with another. It's about understanding that divinity was once visually plural, and plurality destabilizes exclusivity. Now here's the final tension. If ancient gods across civilizations reflected darker phenotypes, Egypt, Nubia, parts of the Levant, segments of South Asia, then the narrative of spiritual centrality shifts geographically, and geography influences civilizational pride, which influences global power narratives. So when discussions about black gods trigger backlash, understand what's really being defended, not theology, identity hierarchy, because sacred imagery has always been political, even when believers insist it isn't. And reclaiming historical complexity feels like threat only when simplicity was serving power. But we're not done, because if darker divine imagery existed widely and later became narrowed, then the question becomes unavoidable. Was that narrowing organic or intentional? And if intentional, who benefited? One more layer remains. Now we confront the present, because none of this matters if it stays trapped in museums and manuscripts. The real question isn't whether ancient deities were depicted as dark. The real question is, why does it feel revolutionary to say it out loud? Think about that. Why does acknowledging darker sacred imagery feel like a political act? It shouldn't. It should feel like art history, but it doesn't. And that reaction tells you everything. For centuries, power defined beauty, power defined normalcy, power defined holiness. And once those definitions harden, they shape entire generations. You don't just inherit beliefs. You inherit aesthetic hierarchies. You inherit unconscious associations. You inherit which faces feel authoritative, which faces feel divine, which faces feel default. Now imagine undoing that, not through outrage, through awareness. Awareness destabilizes illusions quietly. and illusions rarely collapse gently. Here's what makes this conversation different. It's not about replacing one supremacy with another. It's about dissolving the lie of exclusivity. Because once you understand that divinity has worn every shade in human history, the psychological cage weakens. No group owns the sacred. No race monopolizes transcendence. But here's the twist. Many people don't want sacred plurality. They want certainty. Certainty feels safe. Plurality feels destabilizing. If the face of God can shift across time and geography, then divine imagery was never about one ethnicity. It was about proximity. It was about people locating the infinite within themselves. That realization doesn't shrink faith, it expands it. But expansion threatens rigid identity, and rigid identity defends itself. Now let's bring it down to something personal. When African-descended communities rediscover darker sacred imagery, it doesn't create arrogance. It often creates repair. Repair of historical distortion. Repair of internalized marginality. Repair of narratives that framed Africa as spiritually derivative rather than foundational. But repair is mistaken for rebellion because any shift in balance feels like confrontation to those accustomed to imbalance. Now ask yourself something honestly. If history had consistently shown the sacred reflected every continent equally, would this discussion even exist? No. It exists because representation narrowed, and narrowing always benefits someone. Now here's the most important layer. The goal isn't to argue that every ancient god was black. That would be distortion in reverse. The goal is to acknowledge complexity, to accept that early civilizations were more interconnected than modern racial categories allow, to recognize that Africa was not spiritually peripheral, it was central, and centrality changes narrative gravity. Gravity determines whose stories orbit importance. For centuries, Europe's story sat at the center of global historiography. Now gravity is shifting, not through destruction, through recalibration. Recalibration doesn't erase anyone. It simply widens the frame. Now consider the psychological freedom in that. When sacred history becomes global rather than hierarchical, identity becomes less fragile, less defensive, less threatened by inclusion. Inclusion only threatens structures built on exclusion. Now here's the final thought. History is not a weapon unless we turn it into one. But history is a mirror, and mirrors reveal what power once tried to obscure. So if ancient deities wore darker faces, if spiritual centrality once radiated from Africa into the wider world, if later centuries narrowed that imagery for political comfort, then what we're witnessing now isn't revolution, it's restoration. Restoration of memory, restoration of complexity, restoration of dignity. And restoration is quieter than conquest, but it's far more permanent because conquest imposes, restoration reveals. So the next time someone says the idea of black gods is radical, ask yourself, is it radical or is it simply inconvenient to narratives that preferred simplicity? Sacred history was never monochrome. It was layered, fluid, adaptive, human. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. That's not politics. That's perspective. And perspective, once widened, doesn't shrink back. The question isn't whether ancient gods were black. The question is why the possibility feels disruptive. And the answer has less to do with antiquity and more to do with power. That's the full circle. Not accusation, not myth, not exaggeration, just complexity restored. And once complexity returns, history breathes again.